Jedediah Boone was a man carved out of silence, as much a part of the land as the ridges and canyons that cut across his sprawling ranch. At 60 winters old, he was weathered, hard-faced, and solitary. His broad shoulders still square from years of ranch work, but his eyes carrying the hollow distance of one who had seen too much loss. To the people in town, Jedediah was a figure of mystery. They called him the Ghost Rancher, a man who lived without a voice, without laughter, without company. For years, he kept to himself, speaking only when forced to, trading cattle and supplies, then riding back out to his ranch before the dust from his boots even settled on Main Street. The silence wasn't simply a matter of habit. It was born from grief so heavy it nearly crushed him. Years back, Jedediah had a wife, Margaret, and a son, Daniel. They filled the ranch with warmth, with life, with the kind of sound that only family can bring. Margaret singing as she cooked, Daniel's shouts chasing the dogs across the fields, the echo of his own laughter when he let himself soften. But tragedy does not discriminate. A fever swept through, taking Margaret first, then Daniel days later. Jedediah buried them both under the cottonwood tree that still stood near the house. From that day forward, words seemed to betray him. What good were words if they could not keep the people he loved alive? So he folded his voice inward, locking it up with his grief, and let the ranch fall into silence. The land itself mirrored his isolation. The house, once painted white, had faded to gray. Shutters hung loose and the porch sagged. Inside, dust settled on furniture meant for a family, not a single man. The hearth rarely saw fire unless the winters bit too cruelly. Jedediah lived in one corner of the home, a bed and a chair as though shrinking his life to the smallest possible shape. The cattle still roamed his land and he worked them dutifully, but not with the vigor of a man building a legacy, rather with the quiet persistence of one who had nothing else left. Neighbors occasionally rode by, offering conversation, but Jedediah's curt nods and long silences drove them away. To him, companionship was a dangerous luxury. If you grew close, you risked loss. Better to live alone, where silence could not betray you. He came into town perhaps twice a month for flour, salt, coffee, and tobacco, and even then his presence unsettled people. Children whispered that he was cursed. Old women said he was marked by death. Young men, full of fire, laughed nervously when he passed. But none dared provoke him, for there was something in his eyes that warned of storms best left unshaken. And yet, despite his deliberate isolation, there was a hole in Jedediah's life he could not admit to. At night, when the coyotes sang, when the wind rattled the windows, he sometimes stared at the empty chair across from his own and imagined Margaret there, scolding him for his silence. He imagined Daniel's voice asking him to tell a story before bed. These ghosts haunted him more than the living ever could. Jedediah had resigned himself to this life, convinced that nothing new would ever break through the wall of silence he had built. The ranch would one day claim him, bury him alongside the wife and son he had already lost. That, he believed, was the end of his story. But fate had a way of unsettling even the deepest silence. Soon 6 women would arrive at his ranch gate, carrying not weapons nor threats, but a proposal so unthinkable that it would shatter the life he had lived for decades. For now, though, Jedediah remained the silent rancher, unaware that his solitude was on the verge of ending forever. Not far from Jedediah's lonely ranch, the land carried another story, a story of displacement, survival, and resilience. Along a dry creek bed sheltered by cottonwoods and mesquite, an Apache encampment had risen, small and temporary, its fires burning low at night to avoid the eyes of soldiers or settlers. Canvas and hide lodges were pitched in a hasty circle, their presence both defiant and desperate, a reminder that not all battles were fought with rifles. Some were fought simply by existing on land that once belonged entirely to them. The people who gathered here had been pushed from place to place, caught between broken promises of the government and the greed of settlers who always wanted more land. Many of the men had been killed in raids or dragged away in chains to distant prisons. Those who remained were women, children, and elders, fragments of once proud families who still clung to their traditions, though the world around them had turned hostile. Among them were 6 young women who bore their circumstances with quiet dignity. Each had endured loss, but each carried herself with strength that belied her years. They were not sisters by blood, but the hardships they shared bound them closer than kin. There was Ayanna, tall and steady-eyed, who had once been promised in marriage to a warrior now buried beneath the desert sand. Her voice was calm, but her spirit unyielding. Tiva, the smallest of the 6, carried laughter still. Though her parents were gone, her joy a balm to those around her. Sani, practical and strong, had the hands of a healer, though she had yet to find someone to heal her own wounds. Nasha, with her long dark braids and sharp tongue, challenged the injustice of the world, unwilling to bow even to despair. Chanoa, quiet and observant, often saw what others overlooked, her silence a form of wisdom. And then there was Kaya, the youngest, barely into womanhood, whose wide eyes reflected both fear and hope for a future she could scarcely imagine. Together, these 6 women represented more than themselves. They were daughters without fathers, betrothed without husbands, sisters without brothers. In the old ways, marriage would have given them security, community, and the chance to raise children who carried their people's future. But with so many of their men gone, they faced a perilous choice: remain unmarried and vulnerable, or seek a bond outside their people, however strange it might seem. The elders of the camp saw their plight. They also saw the dangers that lurked in every direction. Soldiers demanding their surrender, settlers who eyed them with suspicion or worse. To survive, the women needed protection, and protection could not be found within their dwindling band. It had to be sought elsewhere, with someone strong enough, solitary enough, and honorable enough to take them in. It was during council around the fire that Jedediah Boone's name was first spoken. Some remembered him from years past when he traded horses with the Apache before the war's soured relations. He had never shown cruelty nor greed, though he was now spoken of as a man who lived in silence, cut off from the world. To the elders, that silence was not weakness. It was proof that his heart had once known deep loss. Such a man, they reasoned, might understand theirs. The 6 women listened as the plan unfolded. To ride to his ranch, to stand before him, and to offer themselves not as beggars but as partners. Their offer would not be one of pity or desperation, but of shared survival. They would bring work, loyalty, and companionship. In return, they asked for his shelter, his protection, and his acceptance. It was a bold plan, perhaps foolish, but the women agreed. Better to face the unknown than to wither in limbo. That night, under a moon washed pale with desert light, the 6 brides prepared themselves. They braided their hair, tied beads of turquoise and shell as signs of dignity, and promised each other they would not falter. Tomorrow they would ride to the ranch of the man called the Ghost Rancher. Tomorrow they would test whether silence could be broken by 6 voices carrying a single proposal. The day began like any other for Jedediah Boone. He rose before the sun as he always did, the habit of a rancher too ingrained to be broken even by years of solitude. The air was cool, the sky a bruised purple just before dawn, and the only sound was the slow, steady chewing of cattle in the pasture. Jedediah saddled his old bay horse, Rust, and rode the fence line, checking for breaks or signs of strays. It was work that demanded patience, not conversation, and that suited him just fine. Silence had long ago become his companion. By mid-morning, he was back near the barn, mending a broken section of corral rail with hammer and nails. The rhythmic sound echoed in the emptiness, a lonely counterpoint to the wind. He paused to wipe sweat from his brow when a flicker of movement caught his eye at the far edge of his land. 6 figures on horseback were approaching, their silhouettes sharp against the desert horizon. Jedediah narrowed his eyes, suspicion knotting in his chest. Strangers rarely came this far, and when they did, it was seldom for friendly reasons. He leaned his hammer against the rail and stood still, watching. As the riders drew closer, details emerged. 6 women, riding not with the tentative air of wanderers, but with a steady, deliberate purpose. They were Apache, their long braids swaying, their ponchos and dresses worn but dignified. The leader, tall, proud, with eyes that met his without hesitation, brought her horse to a halt just outside the corral. The others fanned out slightly behind her, their posture neither hostile nor submissive. Jedediah's hand twitched toward the rifle leaning against the barn wall, but he did not reach for it. Something in their bearing told him they had not come for blood. Still, his voice, hoarse from disuse, broke the silence in a low rasp. "What do you want?" The tall woman dismounted, her movements graceful and sure. She stepped forward, stopping a respectful distance from him. "We come with a request," she said in accented but clear English. "We ask for your protection, and in return, we will give you our hands in marriage." For a moment, Jedediah thought he had misheard. He stared at her, then at the others, their faces solemn, expectant. Marriage? Protection? His chest tightened as if the very air had betrayed him. He let out a harsh, humorless laugh, the sound startling even to his own ears. "You've come to the wrong man," he muttered. "I don't take wives. Don't take company neither. Whatever you've heard about me, it ain't true. I'm no savior." The woman's gaze didn't falter. "We are not asking for pity. We are offering ourselves freely. Alone, we cannot survive what is coming. With you, perhaps we can. We know you live apart from others. That is why we came. You are a man without a people. We are women without men. Together there may be strength." Jedediah turned away sharply, his jaw clenched. Memories surged. Margaret's smile, Daniel's laugh, the graves under the cottonwood. The idea of taking wives, 6 of them no less, was an insult to the ghosts he carried. He picked up his hammer again, pounding nails harder than necessary. "Go back," he said gruffly. "Find someone else." "I ain't the man you're looking for." But they did not move. Instead, the youngest, barely more than a girl, slid off her horse and began gathering kindling near his barn as though she belonged there. Another set down a bundle of herbs and dried meat at his doorstep. Their leader only folded her arms, waiting. Their calm defiance unsettled him more than threats ever could. Jedediah felt the weight of their presence pressing against the silence he had built like walls around himself. For the first time in years, he sensed change creeping over his land, uninvited yet undeniable. What had begun as an ordinary morning was no longer ordinary at all. 6 women had come to his gate, not with rifles or accusations, but with a proposal that would test every conviction he had left. Jedediah told himself they would leave soon, and yet in the depths of his heart he already knew they would not. Jedediah Boone was a man used to refusing the world. He had refused invitations into town, refused neighbors who tried to share meals, refused to speak more than necessary. But this proposal from 6 Apache women was unlike anything he had ever faced. It rattled him in ways that made his hands unsteady, though he hid it behind the gruffness of a man who had long ago taught himself not to care. After their leader, Ayanna, spoke their request, Jedediah turned his back on them and went about his work as though they had not spoken. He hammered nails, tightened ropes, and busied himself with the corral gate. Silence had always been his armor, and now he wore it thick. But the women did not move. Their eyes followed him, their patience unsettling. Finally, he threw down the hammer, the clang sharp against the quiet, and faced them. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "You've wasted your ride out here. I don't want wives. I don't want anyone. You'd be better off back with your own people." The words hung heavy in the air. The youngest Kaya flinched as if struck, but the others stood their ground. Ayanna stepped forward again, her chin raised. "We have no men left," she answered. "Our people are broken. The soldiers take us, the settlers push us, and the land grows smaller each season. We do not come to beg, we come to offer. We bring hands to work, skills to heal, and hearts to endure. Alone, we will be scattered. With you, we may yet stand." Jedediah's jaw tightened. Their logic scraped against something deep inside him, but he refused to let it take root. "I buried my wife under the cottonwood tree yonder," he said, his voice sharp. "I buried my boy beside her. You're asking me to forget them, to take 6 strangers into my home as if they could replace what I lost. That ain't gonna happen." The women exchanged glances, the weight of his confession settling among them. Chenoa, the quietest, finally spoke. "We do not wish to replace. We only wish to share what remains." Jedediah felt the old ache rising in his chest, the ache that came whenever Margaret's face flickered in his memory. He turned away again, his shoulders rigid. I don't need sharing. Don't need anyone. I've been living just fine on my own, and I aim to keep it that way. Yet even as he said it, he knew the lie in his words. His ranch was crumbling around him. Fences needed mending faster than his hands could manage. The cattle were fewer each season, his herds thinning as much from neglect as from rustlers or weather. The house was hollow, each creak reminding him of what was gone. But pride and pain held him like iron chains. To accept these women would be to admit his solitude had been killing him all along. Seeing his resolve, Ayanna gave a small nod. Very well, she said. If you will not take us as wives, then let us work for our keep. We will not leave. With that, she turned and began to gather brush for kindling. The others followed, Tiva fetching water from the well, Sani setting down her healing herbs by the porch, Nasha inspecting the corral as though planning repairs. Jedediah's mouth opened in protest, but no words came. He had expected them to ride away wounded, not to take root in his land like seeds in dry soil. His refusal had not driven them off, it had challenged them, and they had answered with action instead of argument. That night, as Jedediah sat alone by his fire, he heard faint voices outside, women speaking in Apache, laughter threading through the dusk. It had been years since his ranch had heard such sounds. He told himself it was temporary, that they'd grow tired and leave. But deep down, unease gnawed at him. His refusal had not ended the matter. In truth, it had only begun. Jedediah Boone was a man at war with himself. He had made his refusal clear, spoken the words as firmly as any vow. Yet no matter how hard he tried to ignore them, the 6 Apache women did not leave. They moved as though they belonged, slipping into the rhythm of ranch life with a natural grace that unsettled him more than any outright defiance could. On the second morning after their arrival, Jedediah found water already drawn from the well and waiting by his barn. The woodpile, usually a task that chewed away at his evenings, was stacked high. His supper, which had long been a miserable affair of stale bread or beans, eaten cold from the pot, was replaced by a steaming meal of venison stew seasoned with herbs he could not name. He had not tasted food like that in years. At first he thought it a trick. Surely they only aimed to soften him, to pry their way into his house with small comforts. He tried to resist, keeping his tone gruff whenever he caught one of them near. "Don't need your meddling," he muttered one evening when he saw Sani mending a split in his boot. But she only glanced up calmly and replied, "It is not meddling if it keeps your feet dry." Each day tested him more. Tiva, the smallest, laughed often, her voice spilling like sunlight into the corners of his ranch. She made friends of the dogs, who now followed her everywhere, their tails wagging as if the ranch had suddenly remembered joy. Nasha, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, repaired a section of fencing he had neglected for weeks, muttering under her breath about men who let good wood rot. Jedediah nearly barked at her, but when he saw the posts standing straight again, he swallowed his anger. Chenoa, the quiet one, tended the cattle with such gentle patience that even the skittish calves followed her. Kaya, the youngest, shadowed him as he worked, her wide eyes absorbing every motion as though she were learning a language in silence. And Ayanna, always Ayanna, watched him steadily, her calm presence a reminder that this was no accident. She had chosen him for this trial, and she meant to see it through. Jedediah's pride bristled. His ranch was his world, his silence his armor. To let them stay, to accept their help, was to admit weakness. He told himself he could manage on his own, that he always had. But each night, when he sat down to a meal that smelled of spices and hearth fire, when he felt the warmth of a home that had been dead for years returning around him, his resolve wavered. More than once he considered riding them off at gunpoint. The rifle leaned heavy on the wall, and the thought crept into his mind like a serpent. But each time, he imagined Kaya's frightened eyes, or Tiva's laughter cut short, or the quiet way Chenoa hummed while brushing down his horses. He could not bring himself to do it. They were not enemies. They were women who had suffered just as he had. Still, he fought against the change they brought. He spoke little, offering no gratitude, letting silence hang between them like a wall. Yet cracks formed in that wall despite him. Once, after a long day of repairing fences, he muttered a hoarse, "Thank you," when Nasha handed him a cup of cool water. The words surprised him as much as her. She only smirked and said, "Even ghosts get thirsty." That night, Jedediah lay awake listening to the faint hum of voices outside, the 6 women talking softly in their own tongue. The ranch that had once been a tomb now carried life again, and though his pride screamed to push them away, his heart, tired, empty, aching, knew the truth. He needed them, perhaps as much as they needed him. It was a truth he was not ready to speak. Not yet. But silence could not hold forever. The desert had its moods, and when it chose fury, it gave no warning. For weeks, the skies above Jedediah Boone's ranch had been bright, the air hot and dry, the earth cracked and thirsty. Then, without much sign, a bank of black clouds rose over the mountains one late afternoon, rolling closer with the weight of a threat. Jedediah smelled rain on the wind, sharp and metallic, and his old instincts prickled. "Storm's coming," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But the 6 women heard him. They were scattered about the ranch, each working on her own task. Tiva stringing beads, Nasha patching harness leather, Sani grinding herbs. At his words, they looked up, and without question or hesitation, they began to move. By nightfall, the storm struck with a violence that rattled the ranch to its bones. Thunder cracked across the sky like rifle fire. Rain hammered the ground, turning dust to sucking mud within minutes. Wind tore at the shutters of the house, howling through the chinks in the walls. Jedediah cursed under his breath as he pulled on his coat and hat. He knew what was at risk: the cattle in the lower pasture, penned near the creek. If the water rose, the calves could drown. Alone, it would have been a losing battle. He could not be in 10 places at once. Yet when he stepped into the storm, he was not alone. Ayanna was already at his side, her face set, her braid plastered against her neck by the rain. "Show us where," she said. Behind her, the others appeared one by one, each bracing against the wind, their resolve as fierce as the storm itself. Jedediah wanted to send them back, to shout that it was too dangerous. But there was no time. The creek was swelling, water frothing white against the banks. He spurred Rust forward, shouting above the thunder, "Drive 'em up the ridge! Keep 'em moving!" The women scattered into the storm like sparks from a fire. Nasha and Chenoa swung sticks, hollering at the cattle until the herd began to move. Kaya and Tiva waved blankets, guiding strays back into line. Sani plunged knee-deep into the rising water to drag a calf free, her thin arms straining but unyielding. Jedediah himself roped another, pulling it to safety while rain blurred his vision and mud sucked at his boots. For hours they fought, not against each other, but side by side, united by necessity. Lightning split the sky, illuminating their forms against the storm, fierce and tireless. Every time Jedediah turned, one of the women was there. Ayanna steadying a frightened horse, Tiva laughing even as the rain soaked her to the skin, Chenoa holding firm when a panicked steer nearly knocked her flat. By the time the worst of the storm passed, the herd stood shivering but safe on higher ground. Jedediah's chest heaved, his muscles ached, and his coat clung heavy with water. He leaned on the fence post, staring at the women gathered nearby. Mud streaked their faces, hair tangled, hands raw, but their eyes burned with triumph. They had not faltered, not once. Something inside Jedediah shifted. For years he had believed no one could share his burdens, that silence was safer than trust. Yet these 6 women, strangers only days before, had proven themselves in the fiercest of trials. They had stood in the storm not because he commanded it, but because they chose to. That night, after the storm, they all crowded into the ranch house, the hearth blazing for the first time in months. Clothes steamed as they dried, laughter rippled as Tiva mimicked Jedediah's gruff orders, earning smiles even from Nasha. Jedediah sat among them, silent as always, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt full. The storm had taken more than rain to the land. It had washed away the first hard layer of stone from around Jedediah's heart. And though he could not yet admit it, he knew These women were no longer strangers. They were allies, maybe even family in the making. The storm had left more than mud and broken branches in its wake. It left behind a subtle but undeniable shift in Jedediah Boone's heart. For years he had carried silence like armor, letting it shield him from the world. But silence, once impenetrable, now felt fragile, like a fence missing slats. The 6 women had fought beside him through the flood, risking their lives for his cattle and land as if it were their own. That loyalty had shaken something loose inside him. Days afterward, the ranch carried a different rhythm. The cattle grazed. Safely on higher ground, the barn smelled of fresh hay and the hearth burned nearly every night. The women had settled into their tasks, not as intruders, but as partners. Chenoa oversaw the herd with quiet authority. Sani tended wounds on both animals and humans. Tiva filled the air with laughter while mending clothes. Kaya shadowed Jedediah, as though apprenticing under him. Nasha argued fiercely with him about fence repairs, and Ayana, calm and steady, kept the rest in balance. For a time, Jedediah tried to cling to his silence, barking only the occasional order or muttered thanks. But silence was no longer easy. The women filled the ranch with conversation and song, the cadence of their Apache tongue rolling over the fields like music. At night, when they sat around the fire, their voices braided together in stories of their people, tales of coyotes, eagles, and spirits that guarded the mountains. Jedediah would sit in his chair, pretending not to listen, though every word soaked into him like rain into parched earth. It was Ayana who finally forced the first crack. One evening after supper, she lingered by the fire while the others drifted to their sleeping places. Jedediah was whittling a piece of wood, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "You do not speak much," she said quietly. He grunted. Never saw the need. Her gaze held steady on him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Silence can keep pain inside, but it cannot heal it. Jedediah's hand froze on the knife. His jaw tightened. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of fire. Finally, his voice came, low and rough, as though dragged from a well. "I buried my wife out there. Cottonwood tree by the house. Put my boy next to her." Ayana did not flinch. She did not interrupt. She simply listened. Jedediah swallowed hard. The words scraped like gravel in his throat, unused muscles straining to shape them. "She took sick first, fever. By the time I found a doctor, it was too late. Then the boy... he followed her." His voice cracked, a sound so raw it startled even him. He gripped the wood and knife tighter, his hands trembling. "Since then, there's been nothing worth saying." The silence that followed was not the heavy, suffocating kind that had haunted his ranch for years. It was gentle, like a blanket laid over old wounds. Ayana's eyes softened. "Their spirits are here still," she said. "You carry them every day. But carrying does not mean you must bury yourself too." Jedediah's chest rose and fell unevenly. He wanted to argue, to shut himself away again. But something had broken open. For the first time in years, he had spoken their names aloud, Margaret and Daniel, in the privacy of his mind, if not yet to another's ears. The ache was sharp, but it was alive, not the numb emptiness that had ruled him for so long. That night, he lay awake, listening to the steady breaths of the women sleeping in the other room. He thought of Margaret's laugh, of Daniel's bright eyes. For years, remembering had been unbearable. Now, somehow, it felt like honoring them. The first crack had formed in the walls of his silence, and once a wall cracks, it is only a matter of time before it falls. Peace on the ranch never lasted long. Word had a way of traveling faster than a horse, whispered from saloon to church pew, carried by sharp tongues eager for scandal. It wasn't long before the townsfolk noticed that Jedediah Boone, the ghost rancher, the man who hadn't spoken to anyone in years, was no longer living alone. 6 Apache women had been seen riding his land, fetching supplies, and even selling butter and hides in town. What began as hushed gossip quickly grew into outrage. To many settlers, the very idea was intolerable. An old white rancher living with 6 Apache women? Some saw it as indecent, others as a threat. And to the soldiers stationed nearby, it was worse than that. It was insubordination. The army had worked hard to corral native people onto reservations, to strip them of their freedom and traditions. The sight of Apache women thriving outside those boundaries was seen as defiance. The first confrontation came on a dusty afternoon when Jedediah rode into town for salt and nails. As he stepped out of the general store, he felt eyes burning into him. A few men leaned against the hitching rail, their mouths twisted in sneers. One spat in the dirt near his boots. "Boone," one called, his voice mocking. "Heard you gone and built yourself a harem out there." Laughter followed, sharp and ugly. Jedediah didn't answer. He simply tightened his jaw, swung into the saddle, and rode away. But silence, once his shield, no longer felt strong enough. Their words followed him back like gnats buzzing in his ears. The real trouble arrived a week later. A detachment of soldiers rode up to the ranch, their uniforms dusty, rifles gleaming in the sun. The leader, a young lieutenant with too much pride in his posture, dismounted at the gate. "Jedediah Boone," he called, "by order of the United States Army, you're harboring Indians who belong on the reservation. You'll turn them over now." The 6 women stood in a line behind Jedediah, their faces calm but resolute. They had expected this. The army rarely let go of what it considered its property. Jedediah's throat was tight. Years ago, he might have stepped aside, letting fate take its course. But not now. He stepped forward, his weathered frame straight, his voice carrying more strength than it had in decades. "They're under my roof," he said. "They work this land same as I do. You'll not take them." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. "They're not yours to keep." Jedediah's hand hovered near his rifle. "They're not yours to claim." Tension crackled like heat lightning in the summer sky. For a long moment, no one moved. Finally, the lieutenant spat in the dirt, signaling his men back into their saddles. "This ain't finished," he said. "You're making yourself an enemy of the government, Boone. Think on that." The soldiers rode away, but their threat lingered like storm clouds on the horizon. Jedediah stood by the gate long after they disappeared, his hands trembling, not with fear, but with fury. That night, the ranch was quiet. Even Tiva's laughter was muted, swallowed by unease. Jedediah sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He had spent years hiding in silence, letting the world pass him by. But now, for the first time in decades, he had spoken against authority. He had stood not just for himself, but for others who depended on him. The women knew what it meant. Soldiers would return. Trouble was coming, bigger than storms or cattle drives. But for all the danger, there was a strange strength in the air. The ranch was no longer a graveyard of silence. It was a place of defiance, of belonging, of voices raised together. And Jedediah Boone, once the ghost rancher, had found his voice at last. The lieutenant's warning was not an idle threat. Within days, word spread that the army intended to make an example of Jedediah Boone. To them, his defiance was not just stubbornness, it was rebellion. Allowing 6 Apache women to live freely on his ranch, to work the land as equals, threatened the illusion of control the soldiers held over the territory. If one man could stand against them, others might follow. Jedediah knew a reckoning was coming. The ranch took on the tense rhythm of a place bracing for siege. Fences were reinforced, ammunition was counted, and supplies stored. Yet it wasn't just fear that filled the air. It was determination. The women refused to run. "This is our home now," Ayanna said firmly, her voice carrying calm authority. "If we leave, we will never stop running. Better to stand." Even Jedediah, a man who had spent half his life shrinking away from the world, found himself agreeing. For years, he had thought silence was his only weapon against grief. But silence could not protect those he cared about. His voice and his stand Would have to. The army returned at dawn, not with a detachment this time, but with a small force. 10 soldiers rode up in formation, rifles slung across their shoulders. Dust billowed behind them as they drew near the ranch gate. Jedediah stood waiting, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. The women flanked him, unarmed but unyielding. Their presence was as solid as the earth beneath their feet. The lieutenant sneered as he dismounted. "Boone, I warned you. Step aside. We'll not ask again." Jedediah's heart thundered, but his voice was steady. "You'll not take them from here." The silence that followed was taut as a drawn bowstring. Then the soldiers advanced. What happened next would be told for years in hushed tones. Not a bloody shootout, but a standoff born of sheer will. The women stood shoulder to shoulder with Jedediah, their calm defiance unshaken. Kaya began to sing in her native tongue, a chant that rose against the morning sky, her voice strong and unyielding. Tiva joined in, then Sani, until the ranch echoed with song. The soldiers faltered. These were not captives begging for release. They were women claiming their right to live freely. And beside them stood an old white rancher, weathered by grief yet unbroken, daring to defy both law and army. Jedediah lifted his rifle, not to fire, but to plant its butt firmly in the earth. "This land's mine," he said, voice carrying like thunder. "And anyone who works it in peace belongs here." "You'll not make war on my home," the lieutenant hesitated. He was young, hungry for command, but even he saw the cost of bloodshed. The ranch was not a battlefield. It was a line in the sand. After a long, bitter moment, he motioned his men back. "This isn't over," he snapped. "The law will deal with you, Boone, and you'll regret standing in its way." The soldiers rode off, but something had shifted. Jedediah, the ghost rancher who had hidden from life for so long, had claimed a place not only for himself, but for those who stood with him. He no longer belonged only to silence or to sorrow. He belonged to a family, to a cause worth defending. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the 6 women gathered with him by the fire. There was no talk of fear, no dwelling on what might come. Instead, they spoke of planting more fields, of repairing the corral, of building tomorrow as if it were certain. For Jedediah Boone, that was the true battle for belonging, not rifles against rifles, but courage against despair. And for the first time in decades, he felt that he had won. The days following the standoff passed in a quiet that felt different from the silence Jedediah had once known. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet of grief, but a calm born of hard-earned peace. The soldiers had left, their threat lingering, but their power diminished. The ranch had stood unbroken, and in that victory lay a new beginning. Jedediah Boone walked the fields at dawn, the rising sun washing the land in gold. Where once he had seen only the graves under the cottonwood tree, now he saw life returning. Cattle grazed, fences stood strong, and laughter from the women carried on the wind. For the first time in years, the ranch was not a monument to loss, but a place where the future could take root. The 6 women had woven themselves into the fabric of the ranch as seamlessly as rain sinking into dry earth. Chenoa rode the herd each morning, her sharp eyes spotting strays before they wandered far. Sani tended the sick calves and kept herbs drying above the hearth. Tiva turned work into joy, humming and joking even while hauling water. Kaya kept close to Jedediah, learning the trade of ranching as if she had been born to it. Nasha argued fiercely about planting rows straighter or mending tools faster, but her fire only pushed the work forward. And Ayanna, steady, watchful Ayanna, seemed to hold them all in balance, her calm words smoothing quarrels before they sparked. Jedediah found himself speaking more each day. At first, it was only instructions. Fix that post, ride east fence, bring me that rope. But soon his words grew into stories. Memories of the land. Lessons from his father, even small fragments of the past he had once buried. The women listened with respect, sometimes with teasing smiles, sometimes with quiet empathy. And when they told their own stories in return, he listened too. One evening, under the wide sweep of stars, Tiva nudged him with a grin. "Old man, you talk more than a rooster now." The others laughed, and even Jedediah let a rare smile crease his face. He realized then how far he had come, from a man locked in silence to one who could laugh without guilt. The town, too, began to change its tune. At first, suspicion lingered, but when ranch hands spoke of the Apache women's skill with cattle and crops, attitudes softened. Butter and hides brought into town were of such quality that even the most hard-hearted merchant could not refuse them. Slowly, grudgingly, the ranch came to be seen less as a scandal and more as a curiosity, perhaps even a success. One Sunday, an old neighbor stopped by, hat in hand. He glanced awkwardly at the women working the corral, then back at Jedediah. "Heard you got yourself help now," he muttered. "Looks like the place is thriving." He tipped his hat and left. But the meaning was clear. The world was watching and maybe, just maybe, beginning to accept. But acceptance from the outside mattered less to Jedediah than what had taken root inside his own heart. He no longer lived in a house echoing with ghosts. He lived in a home filled with voices, laughter, and song. The cottonwood tree still shaded the graves of Margaret and Daniel, but instead of sorrow, he now felt their presence like a blessing. He spoke to them often, telling them of the life growing on the ranch, of the family that had found him when he thought all was lost. One evening, as the fire crackled and the women sang softly, Ayanna turned to him. "You have been given another life, Jedediah Boone. What will you do with it?" He looked around the circle, at the women who had come to him not as beggars but as partners, at the land that had weathered storms and standoffs, at the fire that warmed more than just the body. His voice was steady, sure. "I'll live it," he said, "with all of you." The 6 women smiled, and in that moment the rancher, who had once been a ghost, found himself fully alive again. Not alone, not silent, not broken, but part of a family. And so the old rancher's story did not end in solitude. It began anew, with 6 brides who brought him back to life, and with a home where grief gave way to love, belonging, and a future as wide as the prairie sky.